Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the HAI weekly seminar. This week it is my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Caitlin Vredenburgh, who will be arguing against rationale explanations as the best way to combat algorithmic decision-making. Kate is one of the HAI fellows, and in September she'll be an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy, Logic, and Scientific Method at the London School of Economics and Political Science. During Kate's talk, or after it, during the Q&A, you can ask a question by following the link that's going to be posted in the chat room here on Zoom, or else the one on the HAI events website. Okay, whenever you're ready, Kate.
Thank you. So before I begin, as I understand it, I'm the last HAI talk of the year, which is a great honor because it's been a really fruitful and wonderful year at the HAI with my fellow fellows, such as Todd, but with a kind of rich intellectual community. And I really also appreciate the opportunity to talk to all of you today. So thanks to Celia and Ronnie and everyone else for organizing these online formats that allow us to continue to connect intellectually during this really stressful and horrendous time. Okay, so my talk today will be against rationale explanations. I've got my email there. Please follow up with me if you're interested in anything today. All right, so opaque models have long been a topic of concern in computer science with work on interpretability, but they're increasingly becoming a subject of deep moral concern. So if you think of some examples from your sort of other people's everyday life of when you faced opaque decision making, it might be algorithmic, it might be not. So we all have the experience, hopefully, of submitting our taxes each year. We get back some statement from the IRS that we do have a refund, or we owe money, or we filled them out correctly, but we don't really understand the basis on which this judgment was made. We've just got to trust this institution. Or think about facing the kind of paradigm satire of the bureaucrat. So here I have a little meme that says computer says no. This is from a Little Britain sketch. So the paradigm sort of satire of the bureaucrat, you go into the office and you sort of, you know, make a request, file for something, and the bureaucrat types on the computer and then turns around to you and just says, you know, computer says no. And you're rightfully frustrated. And, you know, this kind of opacity raises not only kind of interesting scientific problems, but deep moral concerns. I'm happy to talk in the question answer period about what features of these models might make them opaque, or kind of interested to hear from you, but I won't touch on that today. We're just going to take for granted that maybe because of trade secrecy, or because of complexity, or because of a lack of causality, many of the models that we get through machine learning or just kind of algorithms are going to end up being opaque. So the opacity has raised such moral concern as these models are increasingly embedded in our institutions and used for decision-making in the criminal justice system, in hiring, in healthcare, and many other spheres of life. And you might sort of think, well, one reason this raises a source of moral concern is that explanations are actually kind of good for us to have in and of themselves. It's good for us to relate to our social environment in a way that we understand the kind of roles that we perform, the jobs that we do. I'm going to set aside those kinds of considerations, although I'm working on a project with a colleague, Stanford Deal at Harvard, on that very topic. But today we'll think about the kind of moral dimensions of explainability in terms of what is it good for? What kind of moral values might explainability or interpretability cannot do? So it's taken to enable values such as, first of all, debugging for bias. So we might be concerned if we're taking some model and using it in institutional decision making, that it's encoded patterns of bias that might be kind of predictably relevant for decision making, but are not the normative bases that we want to be using. And so if we can interrogate these models, if they're more interpretable and we can understand the correlations on which decisions are being made, then maybe we can debug for bias. So a second one, recourse, I'll talk about this today, but the idea is that, if we have explanations, then we might be able to change our behavior if something has gone wrong to get some result we want. Trust, think about, again, my IRS example. If you do trust that the IRS is doing this correctly, that's sort of amazing. And you might think, maybe one important element of having trustworthy institutions is they need to be able to reliably signal to us that they're trustworthy. One way they might do that is through explaining their decision-making processes. Respect, I'll touch on that today, so I'm going to set it aside. Voice is super interesting, an important one. So if you think, one way that we influence the kind of system of rules that we live under, be they our political rules in the public sphere, be they the rules of our workplace or organization, is by having voice, making complaints when we think things are going morally wrong, voting, things like that. Seems like we might need explanations in order to activate our voice. So, if you've got no idea what's going on in your massive company, then you can't morally complain about it and, have a kind of robust debate. Right, so explainability looks incredibly morally important because it enables all of these very basic moral values of good institutions and good kind of model use in institutions. So it's something that we really want. Okay, so we want explanations, but what kind? So the sort of public debate, as well as some of the literature, has, I think it's fair to say, settled on what I called rationale explanations as one of the primary types of explanations that might enable these values I talked about, these moral values. So rationale explanations, I take this from the ICO and Turing Institute Guidance on Explainable AI, super interesting, definitely worth a look. They are, quote, the reasons that led to a decision delivered in an accessible and non-technical way, right? So the definition makes sense on the basis of this idea of giving a rationale. So if you're a decision maker, the thought is you ought to give the reasons, the kind of rationale behind your decision, and that will enable all of these different kinds of values. So think about voice, right? I might not be able to morally protest within my company, the company's policies or decisions, if I don't understand the reasons that led to those policies or decisions, whether they were good or bad. So the motivation of the kind of stress of this kind of explanation is I say users, but sort of, users, citizens, people broadly that are kind of within these institutions need to know what the system is doing, and then probably also some facts about who is responsible. So tech companies have very much taken up this sort of importance of rationale explanations. And indeed, I forgot to mention an important thing, that the ICO and Turing guidance is kind of particularly relevant here because it's being posed as a way to comply with GDPR. So rationale explanations are being also posed as one of the primary ways that organizations might comply with their legal obligations, making it super important for us to think about, are these the right kind of explanatory kind? Okay, so back to companies. So companies are very much taking this approach. So both Google and Facebook, pictures here, you'll have a little description of why you're seeing an ad with some kind of statement about how you might understand what kind of steps you might take to get information that will let you see the reasons you're seeing a particular ad. All right, so how might we extract these rationale explanations? So I think it's important to keep in mind that these rationale explanations really need to be a kind of bridge between expertise, between the kind of, say, interpretability literature in computer science and the kind of, broader public, the people actually within these institutions. So, you've got some opaque model. How might you extract these rationale explanations? Here, overly simple procedure. So we might already be working with an interpretable model. That's great, just manipulate it. Or you might use some technical interpretability techniques to construct a simpler local or global model in order to extract the most important subset of features for a particular decision or decision making. Then you'll want to translate that technical information into accessible reasons. All right, so the thesis of my talk today is as follows. So I actually think for users, decision subjects, and the wider population, the values enabled by explanation are actually better served by two kinds of explanation: normative explanations and population level causal explanations with certain institutional protections. So the kind of message in brief is that I think we're packing a lot of normative weight into these rationale explanations, normative weight which is better served by thinking about two different types. But I do think, and I'll kind of touch on this at the end, but not really argue for it, that rationale explanations can be important for experts. Okay, so here's the plan for the talk. I'm going to fly through these, so please do ask questions. All right, so basically the kind of argumentative strategy is as follows. So recall I'm arguing that actually these moral values that we begin with are better served by other types of explanations than the kind of rationale explanations that have been identified. So what I've done is pick two moral values that I think, at least on the face of it, make a strong case for the importance of rationale explanations. And then I'm going to argue they're actually better served by this these other kinds of explanations that I point out. By no means an exhaustive argument, but I think it gives us maybe some moral evidence that we should be looking at other kinds of both explanations and also institutional changes or kind of other moral concerns. All right, first of all, recourse. So recourse is the ability to change one's behavior in order to sufficiently increase the probability of reversing an unfavorable decision. So this definition I take from a paper from Venkatesubramanian and Alfano from FATSTAR recently, very much worth looking at, highly recommended. And so recourse, basically the idea is, if you think about, say, applying for a job, jobs have sets of criteria, kind of rules by which jobs are given out. And the thought is that people ought to be able to change their change their behavior in order to better qualify, say, for the job, or in the case of credit, say, for a loan, to reverse an unfavorable decision. Okay. Why is recourse so morally important? I think it's there are two foundations of it. So on the one hand, as Venkatesubramanian and Alfano argue, recourse you might think is really important for engaging in temporally extended agency, something that's important for us to kind of both get what we want, but also pursue our life plans. So I'll unpack that a little bit. So it's important for people to be able to make plans, not just in the moment, but that unfold over time, and indeed unfold over the course of their life. And by being able to make those plans, you sort of not only are able to get all of the things that you want in your life, but you're able to kind of form your own conception of what makes for a good life and act on it reliably throughout your life. If you're not able to do this, so if, for example, I don't know, you make a plan to go to school to become a nurse, right? But say you come from a lower income background and you don't at the moment have the liquid capital in order to apply for and complete nursing school. But were you given this, then you would be able to successfully do it, pay back your loan, and so on. Well, if you're not able to both apply for credit, but also know what you need to do in order to reverse that decision, then your agency over time is really stymied. A kind of related consideration for recourse is grounded in equality of opportunity. So equality of opportunity, incredibly important norm, says that everyone ought to have a kind of equal starting place to compete for things like job or political office. Not only might you think, do they need to have an equal starting place, but they need to have the information to allow them to know what to do in order to apply for jobs, as well as change their behavior in order to better qualify it. So think of kind of complaints about admissions processes at, say, Oxford and Cambridge in the US. So they have these admissions interviews for undergraduates. And it's kind of notorious that if you're pretty well off, you can hire a coach to coach you through these interviews. If you're not, you can't hire a coach. And so you don't know the information that you need in order to be a better candidate, change your behavior in order to better qualify. All right, so a motivating case for recourse, I already motivated it, but just kind of quickly. So let's take Abid, a registered nurse in Massachusetts, who moves to California and applies for a job at his local hospital. He's told that he has to be licensed in California, makes sense, which involves paperwork to verify his Massachusetts license, as well as a background check. All right, so it seems that there's a remedy here to a potential problem. So imagine a case in which Abid, had applied for the job in California, but hadn't been told what he needed to do to change his behavior to better qualify for that job. He didn't know what the rules were, say, so he was just told, no, sorry, you don't qualify. But now that he does, he can quite easily get the paperwork, get a background check, apply, and get the job. So it seems like rationale explanations here are a pretty straightforward remedy. All right, so two more cases in order to kind of put this simple motivation for rationale explanations into question. So first case, Abid, a registered nurse in Massachusetts, moves to California and applies for a job at his local hospital. He's told that the hospital needs nurse anesthetists. He's not a nurse anesthetist, sadly. And if he got additional licensing, he would get the job. All right, so second case. Abid, a registered nurse in Massachusetts, moves to California and applies for a job at his local hospital. He's told that if he smiles 30% more in his interview, say 30% more of the time of his video interview, he would get the job. So I take it that those cases point us to important problems with this notion of recourse, as well as the kind of explanations that are thought to satisfy it. So I should say also, again, point you to the Venkat Subramanian and Alfano paper, where they point out precisely these things. So not new arguments here. So it seems that recourse actually, our previous definition was incomplete, and it requires the following two amendments. So recourse should be understood as the ability to change one's behavior in sufficiently low-cost ways in order to sufficiently increase the probability of reversing an unfavorable decision for the right reasons. Okay. On the first point, insufficiently low-cost ways. So think about the first, or I guess the second case of Abid, where he was told, yeah, just go back to school, become a nurse anesthetist. Those are the people that we need, and then you can get a job. This is not a very successful example of giving someone the opportunity for recourse, of allowing them to engage in that temporally extended agency or promoting equality of opportunity, because this course of action is really high cost for Abid. So say, for example, if you thought back to our loan case, someone who wanted to go to nursing school and required a loan, if you said to that person, oh, well, all you need to do in order to qualify for this loan is to work at a high-paying job, get a credit history, amass some income, make sure your income to debt ratio is pretty low. This would not be a low-cost way for this person in order to qualify for a loan. It might strike us as deeply unfair, especially when we recall that for other people, there will be sufficiently low-cost ways that they could qualify for loans on better terms. Say someone who already has a credit history, or someone who, because of a high income, or let's say because of inherited family wealth, is able to put up a bunch of capital for the loan and so gets the loan. Okay. So we'll want to say that people have recourse if there are sufficiently low cost ways they can change their behavior. But we'll also want to say, potentially, that they should be able to, increase the decision by changing their behavior for the right reasons. So think about the second Abid case. So we've told him to smile more, and let's kind of grant that smiling in general is a good predictor of whether someone will be a good nurse. I don't know, healthcare involves evidence and communication, maybe. So, there are a few things to say here. One, even if it's a kind of general, kind of good predictive measure, it might, in Abid's case, not be a kind of good measure of whether he'll be a good nurse. And if he gets hired, this is going to be harmful for his patients as well as himself. So we might think we want to kind of limit these models to deciding on the basis of the right reasons. All right, so if you bought that, you might think, okay, there's still not a problem for rationale explanations. We just need to modify that notion. So you might think individuals should be provided with the reasons that led to the decision, which are sufficiently low cost for her to act on and which are normatively relevant. Oh, I should also point you to this paper by Broca, Selps, and Raghavan that discusses some of these issues of cost and the kind of difficulty of giving people personalized advice. So I think that the kind of criticism of recourse is really onto something, but where that it actually kind of points us somewhere different, and it points us to these two other kinds of explanations. Okay, let me motivate that. So if you think about what's going to be low cost, it's a kind of hopeless task to think about what's going to be low cost for an individual to act on. Giving someone this kind of tailored individual advice about how they can do better by a system of rules is just not going to be feasible in light of the massive amounts of data and the kind of deep privacy violations that we would have to commit in order to find out enough about someone to say, aha, okay, we finally found some low cost ways for you to act. Instead, this low cost is going to be at a kind of population or type level. So it's going to be low cost for this type of person. And there, I think we can often give people advice that they can actually act on, kind of causal advice that where we can say, hey, for people like you, these tend to be the factors that promote certain outcomes. I also think that this requirement that we only give people the kind of normatively relevant reasons that are the basis of a decision is going to be too stringent in many cases. Okay, why do I think that? Well, one option that we could take is say, okay, we've got this model with a ton of features, and we'll just give people, some of the features that we think intuitively are very relevant, and we'll just kind of forget about the rest, right? This, you could do, but it seems like lying, right? It seems a little bit deceptive to say, yeah, we've just isolated the features that we think will be normatively acceptable kind of from an intuitive perspective, and we've just like left out the others, which indeed might be weightier in decision making. So this seems like a problem. So you might say, okay, well, then we just need to restrict our models to deciding on the basis of the kind of reasons that we know to be right. So in the Abid case, we just know that smiling a lot doesn't make for a good nurse. Instead, what makes for a good nurse is a kind of good track record of nursing, certain amount of education, and so on and so forth. So I think this idea is going to be too stringent because on the one hand, often where we use models developed through machine learning is precisely where there's not a kind of scientific and moral consensus on what the right reasons are. And indeed, we can kind of use these models to discover new and interesting correlations. And secondly, I think this kind of extreme restriction weighs a little bit too heavily against values like efficiency or even values like fairness. If you've got a more predictively accurate model, this might be better for, say, groups that were previously underserved by loan agencies because people didn't have a credit history. So finally, the kind of final objections, I think rationale explanations are really, we're leaning on them too much here. So if you recall the kind of case of Abid and the objection that, well, there are just not low cost ways for him to change his behavior in order to get a job. We might be able to do better in giving more or less low costly ways, but you might think this is actually a kind of objection to the system itself rather than an objection to the kinds of explanations we should be giving. So let me unpack that a little bit. So philosophers that have been concerned with equality of opportunity have often pointed out that equality of opportunity is, you might think, an important norm, but it ignores the fact that the kinds of jobs or other positions that you're creating might not be justifiable in the first place because maybe they concentrate too much power, maybe they advantage some kind of people over others. And indeed, whenever we create systems of rules in order to give out positions, we're always going to advantage some kinds of people over others. So take the case of promotion in a hospital. Say that we promote surgeons on the basis of their number of successful surgeries. Well, this might, this is a pretty good metric, but it might disadvantage certain types of people. It might disadvantage people that take on harder surgeries. And so you might think, no matter how we set this up, just in virtue of facts that are not, I'm not responsible for, I'm just not going to say qualify for a bunch of jobs. And so there's a kind of background problem perhaps with the system here that rationale explanations is meant to address. It's actually better addressed by other means. All right, so a kind of upshot. So I think what the previous criticism showed us is that rather than packing everything into this one kind of explanation, these rationale explanations, which are very closely tied to the actual process of decision making, the actual features of the model and the weights, we ought to separate them, also kind of move away from this very close tie to the particular model. So I think there are two kinds of relevant information here. First, population level causal information can give population level actionable information to individuals. But also what individuals really want are normative explanations that can explain why a system or some kind of product, decision-making procedure is a good one. So if you think back to the credit example, a normative explanation of, say, why I didn't get a loan, why it was justifiable for someone to not give me a loan, would, it's important to keep in mind, would certainly give some details of the decision-making process, right? We don't throw all of the information about the model out entirely, but it kind of supplements it and it really highlights, say, why having a system of credit that we do is a good thing in the first place, why the decision that was made was appropriate from a moral perspective, this sort of information. And then finally, we might want to have institutional changes that are needed to make sure recourse doesn't bear too much normative weight. All right, so we're going to go through respect a bit more quickly just for time reasons, but happy to talk about it and everything else in the Q&A. Okay, so it's also worth saying the reason that I've chosen recourse and respect is that I think they also exhibit kind of two different kinds of moral values that you might want explanation to serve based on what you think is important from a perspective of justice. So the first with recourse is really concerned with the kind of distribution of goods. So if you think justice is a matter of, say, equal opportunity for welfare, then we ought to make sure that people have recourse in order to access this distribution. But with considerations of respect, we've moved to a kind of another lens on justice, where justice is really a matter of the kind of social relations between people. Do our institutions encourage, all people to be equally viewed, or do they treat them kind of equally and respectfully? All right, so a motivating case for why explanations might not give respect. So you wake up on your 30th birthday to find two police officers standing over you. One of them tells you that you're under arrest. When you ask why, they just refuse to tell you, but say that their boss will explain. At no point during your trial and subsequent punishment are you told what you've been charged with. So this, I just love talking about the trial in elliptical terms. This is a kind of description of the trial. And you might think the kind of issue with Kafka's trial is not just that because the main character doesn't know what's going on, he can't prove his innocence. It also, I think, kind of strikes us as deeply disrespectful. So what is the kind of relevant notion of respect here, and why would giving explanations satisfy it? So I think the kind of relevant notion of respect is what Stephen Darwall calls recognition respect. It's giving appropriate weight to some fact in deliberating how to act. So if you think about Joseph K., the fact that, he's treated as he is in the novel, just kind of bumbled along through this process without ever being given the chance to defend himself, doesn't give weight to some facts about him, say facts about his innocence, when judges are making decisions. So there are kind of two ways that you might cash out this notion of respect. So you might think, well, when I'm making decisions, right, as a decision maker, I'm obligated to take someone's interest or point of view into account. If I'm, a representative of some state, then I need to take the interests of my constituents into account when I'm making decisions about them. But you might think, well, that's just kind of compatible when we make decisions with doing surveys of people making decisions. As long as I take all of their interests into account, I don't really need to explain the decision to them. Explanation doesn't come in anywhere. So there's this second kind of notion of respect that I think is going to be more powerful here. It's really treating someone with dignity as responsible or with the authority to generate claims. So to treat someone with dignity or as this kind of responsible is to engage in a certain kind of communicative relationship with them. All right, so what does this kind of communicative relationship require? Well, I think it requires two things. Again, neither of which are really closely tied to a rationale explanation. So if you think about the kind of situations that worry us about a kind of lack of explainability with decision makers, there's often a big power differential, right? I go into the bureaucrat's office. The bureaucrat has control over resources that, have a huge impact on my life. There's a huge power differential between us. So it seems that in order to kind of establish a relationship of respect between this powerful decision maker and those about whom decisions are made, say I, the person about whom decisions are made, need to be able to address my demands to a decision maker. Part of recognizing my dignity, my ability to kind of generate obligations is that I can say, hey, here's what I think I'm owed from you. I'm owed, say, kind of, welfare benefits or unemployment, or you're not treating me well. The system isn't treating me well. And then second, what's required is that decision makers can actually justify their actions in terms of those demands. So there's a kind of back and forth communicative relationship where the bureaucrat just doesn't kind of say, but instead really recognizes those demands and responds to those demands in their terms. So again, this kind of second point, I think, highlights that what you really need, often what would better satisfy respect is not a kind of close examination of the actual, again, if we're talking algorithms, features and weights, or particular reasons inside someone's head. Instead, they need to be able to justify their actions in terms of someone else's demands or give what I call a normative explanation. All right. So I'm mindful of the time, so I'm going to go ahead and conclude so we have plenty of time for questions. So rationale explanations do seem very appealing. So I'm also sort of hoping, I should say, in giving this talk that you'll, convince me that I've overlooked a lot of appeal about rationale explanations, because I think that they are appealing. First of all, they seem to best enable accountability. So you can really get into this thought if you think about, say, accountability is a matter of correcting mistakes. So you might think, in order to correct mistakes, I need to know, the basis of a decision. In order to correct some mistake in my, say, welfare benefits on the basis of, a bureaucratic office mistaking that I hadn't turned in some paperwork, I have to know they think I didn't turn in the paperwork, and then I can correct this mistake. And second, these rationale explanations seem to approximate an important human practice, that of justifying yourself. So often when we're faced with other people who have their own moral claims, we need to be able to, not only have a justification for our actions, but actually give them a justification for action. So, I don't know, you are meant to pick up a friend from the airport, you just don't show up, right? You can't just not say anything. I mean, you could. But it would be better if you explained your actions, you explained why you didn't come and get them, and you gave them a good reason, or you gave them an apology if you didn't have a good reason. I have to say, worry a little bit about rationale explanations, because I think they can be a kind of smokescreen for unjust purposes. So they can encourage us to think about what actually, given some set of rules, how can people best navigate them? But they don't encourage us to step back and do something important, which is think about, hey, is this the right set of rules to have in the first place? So some kind of alternative I've proposed, break it out into two different kinds of explanations, causal and normative, and then focus on broader questions of institutional design in order to try to make institutions more just generally. So I think, here's where experts might come in. They might be able to use explainability techniques to probe whether a model is fair and so on in some context, whether it ought to be used in an institution. And then also, and I'll end on this note, we really need to be also having a kind of robust discussion about a model's purpose alongside an examination of why it kind of outputs the things that it does. All right, so some references, some thanks, and again, some thanks to the HAI who's allowed me to pursue this work on explainability over the course of the year. It's been really valuable. Please do email me any questions we don't get to, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thanks very much, Kate, for a fascinating talk. We've got plenty of room for additional questions, so please do not feel shy to ask them. Okay, I'll begin with this one. You assume post hoc explanations after a decision. Could prospective user interfaces with guided processes give clearer understandings? For example, TurboTax into Amazon.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think often these kind of prospective, say, simulations or kind of visualizations to allow a user to understand how some, system is operating are going to serve precisely this kind of important normative value of explanations that I discussed with. So think about, I didn't talk about it today, but think about this example of providing voice. So in order to provide voice, say, I don't know, say you really disagree with Google's privacy practices, and you want to either write to your representative or you want to go out on the streets and protest. It seems that, what you need is some information, or some kind of prospective, precisely information and understanding about how those work, as well as a kind of sense of, okay, should they be working this way, right? So this is how the system works, but is this how it ought to work? And then on the basis of that kind of prospective information, both about how the system works and whether it's good or bad, I, as an individual person, can think through, okay, is this the kind of system that ought to be the case? So yeah, I think you're absolutely right in kind of picking up on these kind of rationale explanations are entirely retrospective. I think this retrospective element of explanation is really important. It's what I've kind of tried to integrate a little bit into normative explanations, but often what we care about is, either going forward, what do I need to do, in which case causal explanations are really important, or as I talked about, maybe I haven't even engaged in a system, I want some kind of prospective understanding of how it works in order to think about, like, you know, should we even be having these systems in the first place? So yeah, thank you for the question.
Thank you for
It's
that.
great. All these questions look like they come from Todd. I know that they come from the audience, but yeah.
Thanks. I think. Okay. Let's ask. Since AI might come up with unexpected reasons for rejection that might be informed by prior biases, won't it open the company or school to lawsuits?
Yeah, this is, so I should say up front, I'm not a legal expert. So I think that the sort of question is getting at, I think, discrimination law and kind of thinking about legal mechanisms here can be a super helpful guide for thinking about when and why explainability is important. So precisely if you think about, okay, how do court systems currently try to handle issues of discrimination? Well, we know that, you know, discriminatory decision making is actually super hard to detect, right? All we see are, say we've got a judge, all we see are some kind of patterns of outputs of judges' decisions, but we don't actually see why the judge has made the decision. We don't see a rationale. And so we might then ask, okay, what do we do about discrimination? How can we do things like bring up lawsuits in order to force a change in decision making, even though we don't have these rationale explanations? And so we might kind of take a cue in thinking about how to deal with opaque models from discrimination law and think about, well, maybe we should be doing things like examining their outputs and using the kind of heuristics we have from discrimination law in order to contest them. Yeah, so I should also, yeah, I wish we had a lawyer here. From what I understand, I mean, it's also unfortunately incredibly difficult to prove discrimination in courts. So I think this also, there are a lot of kind of failings of discrimination law. And so I think we can't just kind of develop models as we will, use them, and then hope that the courts will kind of remedy any bias that's detected. I think we also need to do some upfront work. But yeah, there's a lot in discrimination law, I think, to learn from.
This questioner is curious whether we should look differently at explanations for one-offs versus repeated events.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I take it you mean sort of repeated types of events. So, you know, even if I, for example, don't apply for that many loans over the course of my lifetime, we still might think repeated events, kind of people similar to me applying for loans. Yeah, I think so. They're not going to be distinguished by the kind of stakes, right? One-off decisions can be incredibly important in terms of their kind of stakes for individuals. But I think that repeated events are a lot of the concerns about explainability get going because we really think about these models being embedded in institutions that make a lot of decisions about people at scale that really affect their life. So you might say, maybe we wouldn't be concerned about, you know, using targeted advertising on me in a one-off, it's not going to have the kind of systemic effects on either me or the population, but it's really when we embed these things in institutions and use them to make a lot of decisions that we, you know, raise a lot of these moral concerns about explainability. So yeah, if that's the sense in which you meant repeated events, I think that's absolutely right. In terms of the kind of stakes, there's not that much to distinguish them. But yeah, it's a really interesting question. I'll have to think about it more.
Should we ask people what kind of explanations they want?
Yeah, I would love to ask. Oh, sorry, that was your question. I thought you meant should we poll the audience? And I was like, yeah, I'd love to poll the audience and think about,
That would be great. Yeah, no,
yeah. Okay, sorry, the question, should we ask people what kind of explanations they want? I'm pessimistic about how user-focused a lot of these explainability remedies are, for the following reasons. So particularly, you know, in our world as it is, right, we all need to hustle on the labor market, spend a lot of our times at work, we have our precious leisure time, we need to inform ourselves politically and figure out how to vote, and then you kind of ask, okay, you know, users, citizens, people interacting with these systems, go ahead, we've provided you with some nice visualizations or simulations. You can go ahead and use them to learn about it and give us some kind of input. I think, you know, it's the rare person that will take some kind of institution, company up on that offer. And indeed, you know, there's kind of relative differences between the people who have a lot more time in order to do that, maybe a lot more kind of financial stake in what's going on, and people who don't. So I think there's you know, some important room here for explainability processes to be driven by the wider public, but I think a kind of more realistic proposal would be, rather than asking kind of people broadly, think about also asking representatives for people, both formal and informal, and kind of critical voices. So rather than ask me, you should probably ask a kind of, say, variety of NGOs, experts on privacy, people like that. But yeah, I think that's all I have to say about that.
One aspect of social inequality is the information asymmetry between companies and users. Can the post hoc explanation approach overcome risk of infoglut?
Of infoglut? The information asymmetry that leads to social inequality. Infoglut, I'm not familiar with that term. Yeah, so that's a great question, and my research is precisely very much driven by the ways in which information is important in order to satisfy, you know, various requirements of justice or something like social equality. Can rationale explanations, or kind of explanations more broadly, help that? Again, I think, and this is why I stressed in the talk, not without background institutional changes. And indeed, I think these kind of institutional changes are going to be more important than just merely giving people a lot of information, right? We're really awash in a sea of information, but what we need are broad, you know, changes like, you know, broader support for unionization. So people might have a representative at work, someone whose job it is to get information from higher level management, convey it to people, you know, kind of get their concerns, act as an intermediary, or you might have a public body performing a similar kind of function. So I think often when we think about these, how information is important for justice, it's kind of natural for us to think, yeah, great, just give people more information. But instead, I think the ways in which we actually build that into our institutions will often look more like creating positions, making it part of, establishing roles that enable people to help others overcome this information glut, broadly providing kind of resources rather than just mere information.
Any thoughts about the structure of rationale explanations? Do they need to be linearly organized or have a hierarchical or graph structure?
It's a good question. So this is something I didn't talk that much about, but there's of course a trade-off between faithfulness to the actual model and the kind of graspability of the explanations by people. So we know that linear relationships are really easy for people to grasp. And so you might think this gives us a kind of prima facie reason just to go for that, right? Give people information that's easier to understand. But often a kind of, say, hierarchical or graph-like structure is going to be more accurate to the actual model itself. And so sometimes I think the kind of former kind of explanations, if they're too simplifying, can seem like lying. And there's a danger if we kind of like require or encourage decision makers to just give those, but they'll offer these kind of overly simplistic reasons that might not really get at what's factually or morally important in the situation. So I'm inclined to be a little context specific about that and still say, in a lot of cases, maybe a kind of linear, simpler model is better for people when we're thinking about experts or we're thinking about high stakes situation. Maybe another more complex set of information and way of conveying it is more important. But yeah, it's a great question.
How does your work apply to explanations in consumer products like AI systems in the home that make decisions about changing the physical environment?
Yeah, so one I think common problem with such at-home devices is that consumers often use them without really understanding, say, the information that's being collected, maybe what they tend to do in a range of circumstances that are abnormal, the kind of, say, energy use or other ramifications of using them for good or for bad. So there's been a kind of long literature in moral political philosophy, information science, and so on, criticizing the ways in which the kind of consent model as it currently stands is inadequate for thinking about whether people have, we can say that companies have told people enough or put people in a good enough position to decide whether they want to be using those kind of items. So here's where I think normative explanations can come in, that in fact, even though there are certainly there are kind of considerations, there are limitations of just relying on people's consent. But in order to have consent, people need to have a kind of good enough understanding of what they're consenting to. And here's where I think that kind of prospective or normative explanations can be really helpful for people in these contexts.
What are normative and causal explanations? I guess what are the normative and causal explanations for the case where Abid is rejected due to the rationale explanation that the hospital needs nurse anesthetists?
Cool. So here, there just might not be a kind of causal explanation if we think Abid is pretty well qualified. He doesn't need to, or he like doesn't want to change his behavior in the relevant way. So I think in this kind of case, a normative explanation will be important, and it will be an explanation that's kind of in part of the particular decision. So to say like, we didn't hire you because, you know, you're not actually a nurse anesthetist and that's what we need. But also in terms of, you know, why having the system of hiring that the hospital does is, you know, a good one. So you can imagine a kind of nearby case where Abid has a bunch of different, you know, skills, capabilities in nursing. He prefers, say, to be a nurse anesthetist because it's higher paying, but he's actually really good at doing something else, which is critically more important. And so the, you know, if you had two positions open, then the hospital might say, well, we actually don't want to put you in the position that you prefer. We want to put you in this other position that's more important. And it seems like in that kind of decision, they need to give him not only just the kind of like, here's what we were thinking, but also like, here's why we're actually think it's okay to override your preference here, because it's incredibly important for patients to have good doctors, and this is a kind of high capacity, you know, job in which you'll do a lot more good. Do you want to take it? And so I think in those kind of cases can illustrate how sometimes when we're making decisions about people, the explanation we need to give them is, you know, it might cite some facts about our own reasoning, but it needs to be a little bit broader and say things like, you know, why the kind of criteria that we chose were good, as well as what they were, or why we're making a certain decision about someone and it's appropriate. And yeah, just to correct, I mean, it's very simple, but you might say the kind of population, it's not really a population level causal explanation about Abid, but, you know, one explanation piece of advice for him could just be like, you know, there are other jobs for nurses elsewhere in California, so you should move there to get those jobs. But more important, I think, will be a kind of, you know, justification for why we think that's okay.
Could your work on explanations be useful in institutionally accounting for the constituents' interests prior to algorithm design and implementation?
I would hope so. So one thing that I think is important in thinking about explainability and the tack that the presentation tried to take is, I think explainability is a good thing to have, kind of apart from other considerations. But what this encourages us to do is to think about what are the kind of more fundamental values that explanation can serve, and what are the kind of duties of decision makers or kind of actors within corporations or with institutions, and how might explanations help serve those. And so by this strategy of thinking about these kind of fundamental moral values and thinking through kind of like, okay, would this kind of model or product that I'm developing actually be like, could I sit someone down and give them the reasons why it's a good thing to have? And so I think thinking in that kind of way can be very powerful from a prospective lens. And it might help you kind of get into the mindset of thinking like, okay, well, who do I need to sit down with in order to give them this justification, right? Who's going to be affected by this sort of product?
Okay, I think that's all we have time for. Thanks so much, Kate, for a fascinating talk and a fascinating informative question and answer session. Everybody have a great weekend.
Have a great weekend. Thanks for tuning in.